Do you often feel like you have little strength? Do you need to know today that God is bigger than the weakness that you have or the situations around you that you face that you seem too weak to overcome? That's what we're going to address today on Flourishment. Flourishment is sponsored by Access More. Today, I have with me my friend and wonderful woman of God, Debbie W. Wilson. She is an ordinary woman serving an extraordinary God. Drawing from her walk with Christ, 24 years as a former Christian counselor and decades as a Bible teacher, Debbie writes and speaks to connect sojourners to the heart of Christ. Welcome, Debbie. It's always a joy to be in your presence. I'm so glad you're on Flourishment to share with listeners today.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy it when I can connect with you.
So I'm going to ask you the big question. Why this topic? Why do you feel personally connected to feeling as though you have little strength and need a big, big God?
You know, Tina, when the Lord called me into ministry, I was in college. I was a senior in college, and I was debating on whether to go to graduate school or whether to get an internship. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew what I didn't want to do, and I didn't want to go into ministry. And I I sensed I was at a conference, and I sensed the Lord say, I want you to apply for this ministry, this international student ministry. And I wrestled, I wrestled all night, like Jacob. I wrestled all night and told him all the reasons I was not the right girl for that. And I was sure that our perfect God had made his first mistake in calling me. And I tell that story because I realized God didn't choose me because of what I could bring to the table, but as an opportunity for me to experience Him. And I did join that ministry, and I grew up in my faith and learned that I loved what I was doing. And ever since then, it seems like whenever God calls me to something, my first thought is, choose somebody else. I'm not the right person. And yeah, when I get into that place, because it's something bigger than I can do in my own strength, that's where I experience a big God.
That is so relevant to so many of us, I'm sure. We all experience moments when we're facing something we feel is our calling, our destiny, our next right step in life. And yet it is outside our wheelhouse. It's beyond our training. It's more than we believe we can do. And we're doing this at a time of year when people are thinking more and more about doing something different, and it's scary. It's scary to step outside of what your comfort zone might be, even if what you're in isn't particularly comfortable, at least it's familiar. Can you talk to the people who are in a place that's familiar and yet they know they're called to do something else?
Yes, and you know, I like what you bring out with the familiar because I can remember even as a mother when my second child was born, he had his nights and days mixed up. And so he didn't sleep at night. And when he would go to sleep, about 2 hours later, my 2-year-old would get up and she'd be at the side of my bed at 6 o'clock going, Hey, mommy. And I'm like, no. So, you know, it's even in the everyday things that we are put in places where we realize, I don't have enough strength for this. I can remember getting in the shower going, Lord, how can I function without sleep? and and yet those are the places we find God's strength. And then in those places, God has given me different opportunities. Like one time, my church came and they were building a new building, and they asked me if I'd head up the decorating committee. And I was like, well, I love decorating, but I've never done a church. but there was this excitement too. So what I found is sometimes there's, like when he called me into ministry, there was just dread. And then the excitement came when I said, okay, Lord, whatever you want, I'll do it. But I've also found that sometimes, even though I feel overwhelmed, I want what I'm asked to do. There is a burden there, or there's a desire too. And I've seen in so many cases where, like, I love the Bible stories, and Deborah needed Barak, and Barak needed Deborah. Deborah was a prophetess. She couldn't go and fight the enemy. She needed a general. The general didn't have the same line with God that Deborah had, and he wouldn't go into battle without Deborah. And sometimes God brings other people to help us in those places.
So what you're saying is when we're in familiar places or uncomfortable places and we know we need to move into something that we don't know whether we can handle it, he's not going to call us to do it alone. He's going to equip it himself, or he's going to equip us by bringing other people that he's equipping also into our lives to help us move forward.
You know, he did that with Moses too. You remember the story when God called Moses, and Moses is arguing with him, and then finally he says, "Well, I've got your brother Aaron coming." He already knew that Moses was going to need a little bit of help and encouragement.
I think the key is not focusing on how weak we are or how strong we are. We need to turn our focus toward who is equipping us.
You're exactly right. Um, you know, going back to Moses, I can identify with Moses a little bit, but when Moses felt self-confident, he just stepped out and tried to take care of it, delivering Israel from Egypt all by himself, and he messed that one up, and he ended up in exile in the wilderness for 40 years. And then when God came to him, he focused on his inadequacies. He said, "Who am I that I should go and do this?" And whether we're focused on how gifted we are, or we're focused on how weak we are, we're still focused on ourselves. And I love what God said when Moses asked him who he was. He said, "I am. I am who I am. I am everything you need. So get your eyes off yourself and put them on me." And Tina, I think what you brought up is so important, is that when we're focused on ourselves, good or bad, is not a good place to stay. We need to put our eyes on him.
And I so often get struck with that same attack from the enemy over and over again about being a failure, about not being enough, and not ever being able to quite do enough or be enough. And then one day God said to me, "You're right. You're not enough." But that was exactly what he answered to me. He said, "But I am.
Yes.
I am." And I think that's what we need to focus on, right? That's what your book is about. It's about focusing on how big God is. Can you talk a little bit about some practical things that help anchor us in that? Because I think sometimes we need a specific word or a specific activity to help us move from a place of being stuck in our smallness, our weakness, our little bit of strength, toward being able to move forward in faith.
Um, I love looking again at the Bible stories, because these people lived in desperate times, and our world has gotten desperate in so many ways. And so we can follow their footprints. And one of the stories I love is the story of the midwives in Exodus 1. Pharaoh calls in these two slave women and tells them that they are to kill the baby boys, the Hebrew baby boys, when they're being born. So they're Hebrews. They believe in God, but the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was a god. You did not disobey Pharaoh. And they're two slaves, and they're two young women. So what are they to do? And what they did was, it said they feared God. They had a reverence for God. And God had said, that we are made in the image of God, and they knew that human life was sacred. So by knowing what they couldn't do, it showed them what they had to do. And they let the baby boys live. And they didn't know what was going to happen because they knew they'd be called in. But God protected them. And it says he gave them families of their own because they feared him instead of living by intimidation of Pharaoh.
So I'm hearing you say from that story, we can take away a practical step, identify the places that are not an option. And sometimes the things that we are dreaming about and, well, daydreaming about, the things that we are mulling over in our minds over and over again are, I wish I could go back. I wish I could stay where I am. And those two things are often not an option. You can't go back. And sometimes you can't really stay very well where you are. We think about those things and we ruminate over those, and they're not options. So, first and foremost, identify what isn't an option.
Exactly. And we get that by knowing who God is. And when we know who he is, it's like this respect for him says, you know, I'm his child. I can't go there. Everybody else might be doing that, but I can't. And I like your example, Tina. There are things we can't do, so don't even entertain that. Why waste your energy doing that? And so that I think that's a good one. Another Bible person I love is Gideon, and Gideon was one who had very shaky faith. In fact, he was in hiding when the Lord showed up and called him a mighty warrior. And I can't help but think he was thinking, are you being sarcastic? What is this? um, but he asked the Lord for reassurance. He asked him like 3 times. And a lot of times we talk about Gideon's fleece. That fleece, as you know, Tina, was not a sign of faith. It was a sign of doubt. And he said, make the fleece, it was a lamb's fleece, let the wool be wet from dew and the floors dry. God did it that way. He said, maybe that was too easy. Let's do it the other way. God did that. And God over and over again gave him reassurance. And that was okay because it was in that place where his face was shaky that he got to engage with God. And he ends up building an altar calling the Lord his peace. And so he went from this place of frustration to this place of peace. And then he became mighty in battle because he obeyed God with each reassurance. He said, okay, I'll take the next step. I'll take the next step. I'll take the next step. And before long, he's a mighty warrior, just like God had said he would be.
I'm hearing two extra practical steps in what you're saying there. Secondly, identify where God is calling you next. What is he asking you to do? And then third, don't be afraid to ask God for bigger faith. When you
You,
don't have it, he's patient and he's willing to answer you and strengthen the faith that you don't think is strong enough to do what he's asking you to do.
you said it so well, Tina. And I love that he didn't say, okay, I've told you enough now. God comes to him and says the night before the battle, if you need a little more reassurance, go down in the camp and hear what they're talking about. So our Lord is so understanding. He knows. I love the Psalm. I think it's 103. It says, we are but dust. That's a lot of comfort. The Lord knows I'm but dust. And it's his strength in me.
And that's the key point, is keeping in mind it's not about our strength. It's
Yes.
about what God can do. And we have to keep that ahead of us. How big is the God you believe in? If he's not big enough, then what do we do? When we don't believe enough in God, not that he isn't actually big enough, but the God that we are thinking of may not be the real God. We may be making him smaller in our minds. We may be imagining a God that's less than the God that really exists. So, what do we do to match up our image of God with the real, true image of who God is? I don't think we'll ever really be able to conceptualize how big God is, but how do we grow our view, our perspective on how much bigger God is than we imagine him to be.
I like what you said, Tina. You know, when our view is of God is small, then our problems are going to be big, even if they're not big. But as our view and understanding of God grows, then Isaiah said the nations are but dust on the scale. So our problems bow before a big God. And, you know, we had a solar eclipse not long, a few years ago. And that was interesting because the sun is, I think I read it's like 103 times bigger than the earth. And yet, if I stand outside, I can hold a little pebble over my eye and block out the sun. There's no comparison between a pebble and the size of God. But if I focus on a little problem like that pebble over my eye, it can block out my view of God.
Mm.
And so you're right, God doesn't shrink, but I don't see him. And so he becomes small because that pebble, that problem, that challenge is growing as I focus on it. But when I focus on God, and part of that is the things we've been talking about. It's obeying the next step. It's bringing him my inadequacy and saying, I need help. He says, okay, here's an Aaron, here's the Barak. It's saying, do you mind giving me a little bit more reassurance? But as long as we're engaging with God, our view of God will grow. But when we're focused on ourselves or focused on our challenge, we don't see God, and God shrinks and becomes small for us. For me, my view of God grows when I step out in faith and follow him. And a lot of times, Tina, I'll have to remind myself afterwards, I've never, ever regretted following and obeying God. Never. But if I shrink back and don't follow him, I always, always regret it. And so sometimes I have to remind myself on the other side of this, I'm going to be so glad I trusted God. Even if, like Gideon or Moses, I feel unsettled inside, I'm going to feel stronger when I get through it because I'm going to have experienced God in a new way.
It reminds me of the trip that my son and I did to a waterfall this past weekend. We were at the end of a 3-mile hike and we just decided to, oh, this waterfall is really close. It's only half a mile hike to the waterfall, but it was half a mile straight up. Straight up, mostly a set of stairs. So we're already done with a 3-mile hike, and we're not like super athletic hikers to begin with. So we're like a third of the way up, and it's at the top of a mountain already. So it's high altitude, and we're not high altitude people either. So we stop and we're like, I don't know if I can make it anymore. I don't know if I can make it anymore. And people coming down from having seen the waterfall are saying it's worth it. It's worth it. It's worth it. And just that little bit of reassurance was enough to go a little higher. And then we stop, go, oh, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And then we go a little bit higher and somebody will say, oh, it's so worth it. It's beautiful. It's the most beautiful waterfall I've ever seen. And then when we finally got to the top, it was the most magnificent, awe-striking waterfall I think either of us have ever seen. It was incredible. It was totally worth the half-mile straight up hike at the end of a 3-mile hike. But if we had stopped, if we had stopped a third of the way up, if we'd stopped 2/3 of the way up, we would have never known what we had missed, and we would have regretted it if we had finally understood later from someone else showing us a picture, this is what you missed. But we didn't regret the tough part of the hike when we got the reward at the end. And I think it's hard to see that on the way up. And that's why we need people who have been to see the waterfall, like you,
Yeah.
who are saying, I never regretted it. I never regretted it. Keep hiking, keep going, even when it's hard. What would you say to that person who's a third of the way up or 2/3 of the way up and they're going, I can't make it one more step. What would you say to that person who's in their life place where they are just thinking, God has called me to this, but I
Mhm.
don't know how I'm gonna make it one more step. What would you say to that person right now?
Uh, Tina, the first thing I thought of was in Hebrews 12, where it talks about the cloud of witnesses. They finished the race. They
Mm,
finished the race. And they're saying, you can do it. Shed anything that's holding you back. And that doesn't have to be sin. It can be that sometimes we take on things God never meant for us to take on. Jesus said, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And he tells us to take his yoke and learn from him because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And I found that a lot of times when my burden starts getting heavy, I have added to God's calling. And sometimes it's as simple as I'm feeling responsible for how you're going to feel about what I'm doing. And if I think you might be unhappy with what I'm doing, or I've got two people and I can't make them both happy, that becomes an extra weight. I remember one time I decided to do a women's day at our church. And we had a large Sunday school class. So I started, it was just going to be our Sunday school class. And they asked me if I'd invite the rest of the women. All these people started signing up, and I'm like, what do they think this is going to be? This is just going to be a fun time with a little teaching and whatever. And I started feeling this sense of panic because I thought they were going to be disappointed. And once I realized that, and I gave that to the Lord and said, this is still going to be a fun day, and we're still going to do a little teaching. And it turned out to be a fun day, and they learned stuff. But do you see what I did? I added to the calling that God had laid on my heart, that I had to make everybody happy. Well,
mm,
that's a formula for misery right there. And so I think if a person is feeling they can't make it, I mean, there are tough times in life. You just cling to Jesus. You cling to Jesus. But ask him. He promises you will find rest for your soul when you bring your burden there. And I am seeing that. I have a lot of people in my life who are going through hard stuff, and they are finding Jesus, and he is carrying them, and he's promised to do that. So if we will be still and go to him, we will find rest for our souls.
mm. So let God carry the burdens, is what you're saying. On that way up the mountain, you have to
Yeah.
let God carry the heavy load.
Yes. And make
So,
sure I'm not picking up loads, "Oh, there's somebody left their backpack, I better pick that up. Somebody left their 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 jug of water, I better carry that." And then all of a sudden, we can't walk, we're just burdened down because we picked up loads that we were never meant to carry.
that is so poignant. I love what you're saying about boundaries, about how you can manage your expectations. I think really the only expectation we should ever have is that God will be good, that God is faithful, he'll be good. And that is our only expectation. He has the rest of everything else in the future already lined up, and we don't need to try to visualize what that's going to be. And any other tips that you have to leave with the listeners and viewers today?
Well, when you're saying that, Tina, I thought of another Bible story, that's listed in Hebrews 11, and it's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And as you were saying that, I thought, remember Nebuchadnezzar said, you bow before this golden idol, or you're going in the fiery furnace. And you remember what they said. They said, our God is able to deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we won't bow before your idol. And so Nebuchadnezzar throws them into the fiery furnace. But and the men who threw them in the furnace died, but they're walking around, and who shows up but the pre-incarnate Christ? And I think that's often the places we experience him is in the furnace.
That's so good. Sometimes we get our greatest strength in the times of the greatest pressure and crisis.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
And so I've said, I want to change my what ifs to even if. What if he does throw me in the furnace? What if God doesn't deliver me? Because I'm guessing when Jesus showed up, they're thinking, oh, we're going to heaven, we're dead. But they walked out and God put them in higher positions. But what if? What if it doesn't turn out like I want to? Even if it doesn't, my God is
Mm.
faithful. He is good. And we have to have an eternal perspective. The cloud of witnesses tells us, and some of those were sawn in two. They lived in caves. They were not, the world was not worthy of them, but they say it's worth it.
Wow. And that is exactly the same thing that I used to tell a lot of anxiety clients when I was in a private counseling practice. Change your what ifs, which are anxiety thoughts, to even if then God statements.
Yeah.
And
There you
that is
go.
a way to just offset all the anxieties about the future when you're focused on your little strength. That's a really good tip, Debbie. I'm so glad that you came on the show today. I know that people will want to check out your new book and get more information from you and stay connected with you. How can they do that?
I have a website, and if you go to refreshingfaith.com, I have some different resources that you might find helpful, and including one is how to get a personal word from God. It's a simple Bible study method, and some other handouts that I hope will be helpful. And I hope you'll sign up for my blog. I'd love to stay connected with you.
I hope that you all enjoyed this conversation with Debbie W. Wilson and that you will check out her website and resources. There's so much available to help you and support you in your journey. And of course, I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be found on the Edify app.